10 Terrifying Truths About Canadian Residential Schools. With Canada being the primary country on the planet to receive multiculturalism as an authority strategy in 1971, its dull history of social annihilation against Native individuals may come as an amazement to a few. Financed by the Canadian government and Christian chapels, the residential educational system was created to execute the Indian in the kid. The last Canadian residential school was closed down as of late as 1996. The following are 10 lesser realized realities in regards to the Canadian residential schools framework and its casualties. 10. Constrained assimilation. Not long after the residential educational system was created, participation got required for kids as youthful as 4 until they were 18 years of age. Understudies had to absorb into Euro-Canadian culture and were restricted from rehearsing their own way of life and religion. In endeavors to make the native kids look less such as themselves and more like European Canadians, school staff washed them in harmful synthetic compounds to ease up their skin, trimmed their long hair short and constrained them to wear Western regalia. The limiting of young ladies' bosoms was normal also, as it was technique for causing them to feel embarrassed about their developing bodies. Youngsters were likewise compelled to acknowledge Christianity, with asking being a day-by-day custom. Moreover, correspondence, counting during class time, was permitted in just English or French, dialects which a significant number of the kids didn't comprehend. 9. Division from family. Since all native kids' participation was compulsory, the youngsters were regularly coercively taken from their homes. Guardians who attempted to oppose were beaten and captured. Different guardians who gave authorization for their kids to be removed were intentionally given bogus data about the motivation behind the residential educational system and the way of life at the schools. On the off chance that kin were adequately fortunate to be shipped off a similar school, they were as yet isolated because of the sex isolation that existed at all schools. More often than not, understudies were restricted from visiting their families at all until they were 18. This included occasions and surprisingly the burial services of friends and family, the passings of whom the youngsters were here and they're never educated regarding. The kids needed to compose letters home in dialects that were unfamiliar to their folks, and any blessings or letters their folks sent back were retained from them by the ministers and nuns that ran the schools. 8. Low quality of life. The personal satisfaction offered at these schools was awful. Most of an understudy's day was spent showing the school to cooking and cleaning, on the grounds that the residential educational system was underfunded to the point that appropriate consideration couldn't be managed. The schools were stuffed and needing fixes, this made the functioning conditions hazardous. The understudies were starved and malnourished, just as denied of clinical consideration and inappropriately dressed throughout the cold weather months. 7. Coercion to nutritional experiments. Now and again malnourished kids were exposed to healthful tests with the government's information and, obviously, without their folks' assent. Youngsters that were at that point undernourished were famished and utilized as test subjects in tests that have purportedly not brought about any huge discoveries. 6. Merciless punishments. Disciplines at the schools were merciless and unfathomably absurd. For instance, youngsters' tongues were over and again punctured with needles as a discipline for communicating in a language other than English or French. Other regular disciplines included electrical stun, imprisonment in confines, copying of hands, public strip searches and forcibly feeding of understudies' own regurgitation when they were debilitated. 5. Sexual abuse. Sexual maltreatment was basic at residential schools. The 2 young ladies and young men were assaulted not just by the clerics and other staff running the schools, yet in addition by more established classmates. Young ladies that became pregnant had to go through fetus removals. Indeed, kids who were physically manhandled were even compelled to appeal to God for the direction and absolution of their victimizers. 4. Successive student deaths. Understudy passings were so normal at these schools that large numbers of their design plans included burial grounds. Passing rates at schools went from 30% to 60% inside the initial 5 years. These rates are just intelligent of detailed passings, in any case. Since the public authority quit recording understudy passings after a specific point, the genuine rates are in all likelihood altogether more noteworthy. The most well-known reason for death was tuberculosis, an irresistible infection that understudies were vulnerable to because of the absence of isolation of debilitated understudies just as the hardship of clinical consideration. Different reasons for death included suicides, freezing subsequent to endeavoring to flee, and mishaps that came about because of the perilous working conditions kids were presented to. 3. Intermittent resistance by students. Here and there, understudies would endeavor to oppose the brutal conditions they had to live with. Normal demonstrations of defiance included taking food and fleeing. Understudies who picked to flee never endure, significantly less got back. There are even reports of understudies torching their schools. 2. Inability to provide adequate education or training. Youngsters in the residential educational system were dealt with more like kid workers than understudies. Normally, understudies simply went through 2 to 4 hours per day in the homeroom, and the remainder of their day was spent working. When they were 18, most understudies had just arrived at grade 5. With such little training and acquiring of significant abilities, native alumni couldn't rival Euro-Canadians in the work environment and experienced difficulty securing any positions. 1. Patterns of family abuse over generations. When the understudies of the schools turned 18, they were delivered and permitted to get back to their families. Nonetheless, those getting back were regularly unfit to speak with their families and couldn't relate to either the native or Euro-Canadian culture. The downturn of the never-ending sensation of detachment, just as the way that the kids were raised without affection or care in these schools, brought about an endless loop of physical, passionate and sexual maltreatment as survivors were, and still, can't adore and really focus on their own youngsters.